This week, the student pilot dies. I shouldn't sound so giddy about that, but it was a fun shot to do. Also, I try cycles for the first time. So this is the first shot I wound up rendering in cycles. I will show you the reason I did that was because the explosion looked much better in cycles than in EEVEE. It also meant that this shot took about 2 weeks to render. I set my computer outside or near a window during the winter because it just churned away and I was worried about it overheating, but it was worth it. And let me show you why. The first thing you'll notice is that you can see into the cockpit on this shot, which is why I started the shot at this angle and not closer for the student pilot to crash. If we go back and look at another shot, if you look here, you cannot see into the cockpits because this was all rendered in EEVEE versus cycles. So you'll learn as you're going through stuff that cycles and EEVEE have different properties for different textures and shaders. So this is where I found out that the glass texture here was different in EEVEE than in cycles. And I just didn't know how to deal with it, so I worked around it by starting the shot here. And as it flies off, you'll see he goes away pretty quick, so you can't see the fact that there's nobody in there. So I'm going to step through this shot and discuss everything that we're going to look at when we get to Blender, but this is my final output of the film with the film grain added, and that's why it looks so grainy in this shot, because I added film grain. Anyway, here we go. So the student pilot, who's not inside the cockpit, is flying towards his death to crash into the Death Star, and you'll start to see here they're still shooting at him. Later, I will show you how I made these little blobs of cannon fire. More cannon fire coming and passing as we go. Now, as he gets here and crashes, this is where I did some stuff for the first time and had a lot of fun. So if you look right here, there is actually, I believe, the beginning of my explosion. You can see a little red there. And then as I go one forward, you'll see that my X-Wing actually disintegrates. And you'll only see it for one frame, but I was super proud of that. I used quick explosions. It was one of the first times I ever used it. Actually, probably the first time I ever used it. And it exploded. Now, in reality, it should have kept flying along and breaking up, but I didn't know how to do that. And so it just explodes right in that same spot. And you only see it for one frame anyway. So here we go. X-Wing, quick explode. And then the explosion becomes so big that you don't even see the X-Wing anymore anyway. It's under there, but you don't see it. Now you'll also notice that my explosion starts above the X-Wing. That's because as it rendered, it looked better being higher up for the explosion to fly out all over the place. And going from my X-Wing to the explosion starting to being so big in 2 frames, you can't really tell because it's so fast. Also keep in mind, this was a movie for my 10 and 8-year-old nieces, and I don't think they were going to pick it apart that much. And plus, it was a learning experience for me, so I wasn't going to be too hard on myself. And as I sit here and look at this field of the side of the Death Star with the towers here and all these little different parts, this was one of the first things I did. This is a plane with a hair emitter attached to it, and each of these little sections is a single strand of hair. All of this started from this tutorial from C. Bailey Films, and he is fantastic. Highly recommend his tutorials. And I think at this time he was working for CG Cookie, and then he has gone out on his own with C. Bailey Films. But find his stuff, watch his stuff if you want to do anything sci-fi and space related. He is fantastic for all of it. And without him, I never would have made this film. So I made each of these little greebles, if you will, separately and attached them to this plane, but I will show you that in a minute. So here we go. Our X-Wing explodes, and you can see our explosion get bigger and hotter and fly out all over the place, and then the smoke starts. And it was the explosion and the smoke. The smoke and seeing through the smoke and the smoke making a shadow was why I rendered this in cycles instead of EEVEE, because it just looks so much better. I'll go into the Blender file and try and show it to you. But that's it. That's the whole shot. My X-Wing flies down. I did a quick explosion, and then I did an explosion, the quick smoke and quick fire effect. So I added two quick effects to it. And again, this shot took about 2.5 weeks to render. About 4, 5, 6 hours every night. Just after dinner, I'd set it up, or even before dinner, I'd set it up and let it render one frame at a time, because I rendered in cycles. Let's take a look at the Blender file. All right, here we are in Blender, and I'm going to start with my camera. It has 3 keyframes, and it simply tracks along, flies along, and follows the X-Wing, and then it keeps going, and it starts to pivot to track the X-Wing explosion. So that's it. It's 3 simple keyframes for my camera. Now let's go to this plane, the field, the Death Star. I'm going to go here and real quick delete my particle setting just for a second. And you'll notice that it's just a giant plane. It's not even subdivided. So all I did, Command Z, was add a particle system to it, made it a hair emitter. And for the hair emitter, instead of hair, I assigned each of these little greebles. I built each one of these individually, and then assigned them to hair particles for the plane. If we come back here to the plane, there are many tutorials on this about how to do this. It is fantastic. Once again, C. Bailey film, highly recommend it. The hair length is how you decide the size. So if I go down to 1, the size of them, and so now they're super small and then don't cover the plane. So Control Z, go back up to the size I had them, and now they cover the whole plane. That's how I built that giant plane of a Death Star. Lighting wise, for some reason, I have 2 sun lamps that seem very close to the Death Star, and back then, I was not fantastic at lighting. I have learned to embrace it more, but apparently it was enough light to light up my Death Star. I also, let's move along here, have a light above my X-Wing to light it as it heads down to the surface to explode. And it follows along. It tracks along with the Death Star. In fact, it looks like, yes, it is even parented to the cube that controls the plane. So it moves along with it. Boink, boink, boink. Yes, there we go. So once again, my X-Wing will fly and explode. Let me get in here real close. These are going to be my fire emitters here in a second. I will hide those. Boink, and then boink. And we're going to come down here and watch our... let me go out of viewport shading and go into just my little gray shading so we can see the explosion down here. So here we go. So my X-Wing is flying, and then there it goes. I added a quick explode to it. Now because my X-Wing is a bunch of different sections here, I had to add quick explode to each of them. And I probably did them all by hand. You could probably copy and paste them, or do the old copy selected and transfer quick effects over. But I'm sure I didn't do that. But there's my explosion for my X-Wing there. So here it goes, and then this is the only one you see. By here, the explosion has gotten so big, as you can see above, up here. We'll discuss that in a second. That you don't even see it. So it's just one frame of explosion, and then we never see it. But I was very proud that I was able to do the quick quick effects and make my little X-Wing explode. Now let's go up here and see if this is going to work properly for me for my explosion. No. My explosion, which I probably baked, doesn't seem to be working right now. So I'm going to jump over to EEVEE for a second because this will be easier to see. But as you see here, I did render this in cycles for the explosion. But in EEVEE, you will be able to see better these laser cannon fire shots. So they simply, each of them have 2 keyframes. Oh, look, no, sorry. They have more keyframes, probably to get them started and framed right. But they just sort of sit there in space. They're not actually coming out of any specific cannon. And you can see once they get in frame of the camera is when I decide to move them. So like this one here, it has 3 keyframes, probably one to make it small, and then when I need to see it larger, so it goes small, comes large, there it goes, and it goes out of frame. And then here, I probably just have a separate keyframe just to get it to way out of frame so it's not going to come back in. So basically, I keyframed these so that they would specifically fly through the frame when where I wanted them to, so it looked like he was taking a lot of cannon fire as he went down to explode into the surface. So now let's look at our explosion. So I'm going to go back up here. I'm going to switch over to EEVEE for a second because it'll be easier to see as this thing explodes. And we can go into EEVEE in this as well. So at first glance here, when using EEVEE to look at this explosion, it doesn't look bad. But as we get out here, you'll be able to see the shadows aren't fantastic. In fact, there are no real shadows hitting the Death Star. The explosion looks decent. I don't mind the explosion because, so yeah, it looks a little cartoony, but I don't mind that. But I wanted the shadow on the Death Star, and I wanted to bring a little more realism to this. So I switched over and used cycles. And now you can see there's shadow. There's much more interesting information because it is creating shadows and reflections of this onto the Death Star. It's a little harder to see as I scroll through because it takes a second to render this out. But as you can see up here, look at that beautiful shadow on the Death Star. So that is why I wound up using cycles instead of EEVEE for the first time in this animated short. And then going forward with my next short, I will switch over and become a cycles guy just because of the realism, and I liked it much more. But more on that when I start discussing my next short. But that's it. My X-Wing crashed and exploded into the Death Star, and each of these frames took an hour or 2 to render very slowly back in the day. And as I said, I would sit my computer outside in the cold and let it render at night while I watched television, and I would check on it periodically to make sure it wasn't overheating. And just part of the learning process. This was a really fun shot to do. Next week, the red and blue leaders fly off to the Death Star. I'll see you then.